Please join me in welcoming Elliot Bostwick Davis.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and also Johnny, who's up there helping us out with a little bit of, we hope, internet magic in a moment. But it's really special to be here. We've been working on the Mexican Revolution, as those of you know, in the semester course, but today we're working on the American Revolution, and I'm shamelessly bringing along the Spotlight publication, which is on your reading list, because I note that there are some very special people in our audience, and if there are others, this book is actually dedicated to members of the armed forces, past and present, and also our very important gallery instructors and museum associates, and especially two gallery instructors right up here up front, Amy Forvu and Azi Dejani, because they helped in wanting this book to come to fruition for, I don't know how many years, it's been a long time. But we'd like to call these small spotlights, it's a brainchild we had in the Art of the Americas, started with Erica Hirschler, of a single, which she did the Boyd book, but we thought about a single publication that really allows you to see a work of art from 360 degrees and also over time. So that's what you're going to see in this publication, but in our case, I like to also think of it as the Atul Gawande version of writing, because we do write these between meetings and between projects, so they happen on the fly. So without further ado, I wanted to tell you about this picture, which had fascinated me from the time I arrived at the MFA, really because it was in storage, rolled up, and I really couldn't see it other than on a black and white image, or actually we did have an old color image of it. And as you heard from Kristen in that nice introduction, I had come from the Metropolitan, so I was quite familiar with the Leutze painting of a bit later of 1851, here shown in its reproduction frame that was reproduced for the opening of the American Wing at the Met in 2012. But I really became fascinated with this picture because I couldn't quite figure out exactly what was going on and what Sully had been inspired to paint. And in that regard, of course, we know it's the one of the pivotal moments in the American Revolution, Christmas night, 1776, but how did Sully come up with this enormous monumental canvas that's really 12 by 17 feet? And in effect, we almost designed, as you'll see at the end, I think the whole first level of the wing around this picture because it had never been hung in its original frame ever before. I also had a very tangential personal connection to this picture in the sense that a member of my mother's family had actually fought with Washington as a young man as an aide-de-camp, and I didn't really know much about him at all because we had just sort of lost, connection with that link. But in any event, I wondered, again, what would it have been like? He was definitely there in the passage of the Delaware. So with that, let's take a look at what Sully had in mind to get to this place of 1819 of the passage of the Delaware. At the time that he was thinking about this commission, which was commissioned by the North Carolina legislators after Washington's death in 1799. He was born in Washington in 1732, and he lived until 1799. And huge outpouring as the nation began to think about its own history during the Revolution and how to represent that. So these two busts had been produced. The one by Houdon there on your right of the screen, the French sculptor who came actually to the United States and actually had Washington sit for him and posed him from life at Mount Vernon at the end of his career. And as well, it's said that Giuseppe Carracci, in this bust, which is at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, also had an opportunity to pose Washington from life. We're going to hear more about those in a moment. So there's a great deal of interest in thinking about how to present a new nation like the United States, a new republic, in an international context, and what kinds of models to use. So of course, at the left, you can see they're using the great images of antiquity of Roman senators and leaders there. Of course, this was not an isolated event. In fact, it occurred across many different kinds of media. And here in our own museum, we happen to be extremely rich in the works of the neoclassical period because so many of them were being produced by furniture makers and designers here in the Boston area. So for instance, Oak Hill Rooms of 1804, just 5 years after Washington's death you see there at the lower part of your screen with all of their details of the moldings, the fireplace surrounds, and the furniture that are all meant to work en suite. These were commissioned by a female philanthropist, Elizabeth Derby West, whose father, Nathaniel Haskett Derby, had been one of the most prosperous shipping merchants ever, considered the first, quote, millionaire in the United States. And so she had the wherewithal to commission Samuel McIntyre to create these settings, but they were all about presenting the United States as a worthy nation and one that could represent a populace that was living along the ideals of, for instance, here's Columbia at the top of this Skillen and McIntyre chest here, Skillen doing the carving there. So neoclassical Grecian kinds of sofas would have been of all the rage, and you see similar kinds of fluting and decoration from the neoclassical based on the classical forms in forms like silver. So you'll find this in our own New Nation Gallery, but you'll find it as I travel around the United States. I see that throughout many of the installations of art of the United States as well. So they're often presenting it in this way. So here's our man of the day, Thomas Sully, in his own self-portrait from 1807. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about Sully, as you have there on your handout. He was born in Horncastle, England. His parents were both actors, which is interesting and I think does, no pun intended, play out in our story here. He had a number of siblings, and at a young age, he, in search of greater opportunity, traveled to the United States, settling in the South, which again is going to be important for our story. What I'd like you to note in this work is how he's really exploring light and shadow on his face there. He looks a little bit tentative as the young artist that he is at that point as he paints himself. But yet look at how he's demonstrating he wants to be able to paint surfaces with a light touch here, this fur collar. And I think there again, that's something you're going to see played out in the passage of the Delaware. So he has to make a living. His parents are actors. His father sets him up with, I'll go back to him so we can think a little bit about him before we go ahead. His father sets him up with an accountant in the city of Charleston, where he's working after moving a couple of different cities. And so he's in Charleston, and his work is, his father feels that as an actor, and the mother being an actor, that they want a proper profession for this young man. And so they feel that the accounting field would be the right place for him. And fortunately for him, at the accounting firm, there was a great deal of supply of paper. But after a number of months, the master who had apprenticed him said, well, we're getting a lot of use out of the young Sully, but unfortunately it's not the kind of work we need on the paper here, so we're going to have to let him go. He was doing too much drawing every day as opposed to figuring on that paper. So as a young person, fortunately in Charleston, there were a couple of artists he could work with there. One had a small classical school, and the other was his brother-in-law, an artist, a French artist named Belzon. Unfortunately, they had a massive falling out, not clear why, although perhaps I think reading between the lines is probably that he was more talented than the brother-in-law. So he departs from Charleston and goes to live with his brother in Virginia and starts traveling around as an itinerant. But he's got to really make a living. He had early on had lots of different kinds of careers. His family had even gotten him into the stage act. He performed on the stages of Charleston and in Virginia. But he's working his way as an itinerant portrait painter in the Commonwealth of Virginia at this point, living with his brother's family, which is getting larger and larger as their own family had been as well. And he's diversifying himself into a field of fancy pictures. And here in this one with the introduction of light and shadow, I just want to introduce this concept of fancy pictures. It's happening in England in the late 18th century in someone as august as Joshua Reynolds, Sir Joshua Reynolds being the head of the Royal Academy in England. And here you see this little boy looking as though he's Cupid. But of course, it's right here in our own galleries with John Singleton Copley when he is he's just about to leave for England, but here he is painting his wife and son as Venus and Cupid. And there's been some discussion recently about whether this picture actually hangs horizontally or vertically. So that's been proposed. You might want to take a look at that next time you're in the gallery. So fancy pictures, thinking about a way to broaden the standard type of portraiture that might be available to really promote additional clients and additional requests. So in this case, our great torn hat, although it's going to be a little bit later, a year later than the Passage of the Delaware, is the type of fancy picture that Sully was painting. And what do we mean by a fancy picture? Well, it's just envisioning a sitter, and sometimes they're very specific sitters, and sometimes they're more generalized based on a specific sitter. This sitter in the torn hat is actually one of Sully's children. And William Kaiser Rudolph, who has been working on Sully, and he's also on your handout as having completed the most recent, really excellent monograph on Sully called Painted Performance, put forth the concept that these fancy pictures were identified by Sully by his monogram, which appears in the torn hat right here on the hat brim. It's T.S., Thomas Sully, and the date of 1820. So he himself, in his own work, may have signaled these for us. And again, I want to keep that in mind as we are going to look ahead at the various parts of the Passage of the Delaware that he left his monogram and signature on. So just bear this one in mind. So at the time, as I mentioned, he's painting different kinds of portraits. This gorgeous one of John Myers, you can see him over in our galleries as well, leaning on the sill there, a very classical style of contrapposto, of sort of leaning on one leg to offset the figure. And it's something that Copley would have used as well. I forgot to put in the tray, but in the images here, but certainly had painted a number of his sitters in that mode of a three-quarter portrait, but as did many of the British painters as well. And here you have him working on one of the more glamorous uniforms, and uniforms are going to be very important to, of course, the Passage of the Delaware. Another one, Major Thomas Biddle. So this is really how he's making his way with the male portraits. He's also doing the fancy pictures, and he is doing a number of whatever he can really get in terms of commissions. Here's another one, Stephen Decatur, and you can go visit this home of Stephen Decatur at right across from the White House, where you can see that historic residence. So full length, more ambitious with the sword, and with a little bit more of a sort of an Apollo Belvedere type of pose. He's also thinking about history painting, and I wanted to show you this one. It's the capture of Major Andre, one of the spies of the Revolution. This work is at the Worcester Art Museum, so you can go see it there. It's more of a cabinet-sized picture, which, as we heard a bit about the interest in images of Washington, and those really went the gamut from very, very public imagery of the kind that would have been a part of the decoration of the United States Capitol, which was ongoing at this time, to the more cabinet size for those who could afford it, the sort of rising middle class, although this would have been at the upper end of that, buying a smaller scale oil portrait. But again, thinking about the Revolution early on, and I just wanted to show you as the century went on, these continue to be quite popular. So in our own collection from the Carolicks, we have this incident of the Revolution, and what's going on here is Washington, who is quite specific about the type of uniform he wears, and we're going to see that later, the blues and the buffs with his officers. This was one of the members of the Continental Army, except that he is not in uniform, and so they sort of took him for a common vagrant. And it happened to be a story about one of the officers in Washington's Corps who did not take as fastidious of an approach to his uniform as others did. So from the Carolick collection, this one not currently on view, but part of our collection, and the very popular throughout of prints of Washington, to the point where by the centennial, when Mark Twain is traveling around the country and writing his views about the country, he says there isn't a bar or a house or any house of lodging or tavern where you can walk in and not see an image of Washington. These began early on, even before he died. This is Edward Savage's version, this also from the Carolick collection. But even at the Metropolitan, where I had been before I came to the MFA Boston, these were part of a whole early 20th century moment of collectors really thinking about, during the colonial revival, collecting every image of Washington. So in fact, we had a whole collection of just portraits of Washington along with a lot of American prints. So what happens to incite this passage of the Delaware? Well, it's quite an exciting opportunity for someone like Thomas Sully. What actually goes on is that the legislators of North Carolina at the Senate chamber and the Capitol building, which has both a Senate chamber and a chamber for the House to meet in, had decided at the time in 1799 that they would, at the time of Washington's death, commission a way to commemorate their great leader in a public space. Now, the reason I'm not showing you that building is it actually burned to the ground, so the new one that is in Raleigh has nothing to do with the old one. But the legislators, it took some time, and as you know, the United States went through its own ups and downs, including the War of 1812, which they considered sort of the second wave, in a way, of the revolution. So they couldn't really enact this proposal that they had voted on with great enthusiasm at the time of Washington's death. I'm showing you Charles Willson Peale because he was really the great painter of the battles of Princeton and Trenton. So just take a look at this and become familiar as we're talking. So the legislators, again, decide in 1816 that they're going to make good on this promise. And now they're going to figure out a way to put out a call to artists to commission works, two different images of Washington initially. One is a marble bust, they say statue, not clear whether it's a bust or larger, of Washington. And the second is a portrait of Washington that's going to copy one by actually Gilbert Stuart. So they're going to call up various people to do this. The great painter of the Revolution who actually fought with Washington is Charles Willson Peale. And they're going to call up his son, Rembrandt Peale, these two working in Philadelphia. And they're also going to call up the young Thomas Sully, kind of the up-and-coming artist of the time. So here, let's take a look at some of the images of the kind that Sully would have known in this sort of commemoration of Washington. Gilbert Stuart there in the classic, what's called the Lansdowne style portrait of 1796, and on the right, his own Washington here at Dorchester Heights, which interestingly, Sully, as you'll see there if you were studying your handout ahead of time, will note that he was able to study with all of these with Stuart and Trumbull, two of the greats who had already painted Washington. And we're going to meet up again with the Washington at Dorchester Heights. But these are the full-length kinds of Washington images that would have been on everyone's mind at the time of the commission, as well as these two, and I suspect some of you have an idea of these. These were closely associated with Boston. They're called the Athenaeum portraits of the Washingtons because they had early on had a home here in Boston at the Boston Athenaeum, and they were later acquired by the MFA Boston in 1980 in collaboration with the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. So if you don't see them here, rest assured they're probably on view down in Washington at the National Portrait Gallery. These were left unfinished. They were painted from life. Martha Washington, as the story goes, never liked the likeness of her husband in this particular portrait by Stuart. Stuart was very happy to keep the portrait on hand in his studio because it later served as the basis for so many other future requests of images of Washington. He even called it his $100 bill for that reason. But it's the image that many of us, if you carry around a dollar bill in your pocket, you'll know this particular image of Washington. And they're very, very freshly painted. So again, something to look at carefully when you think about the passage of the Delaware. This one, the other patriot painter was John Trumbull, and this one was also something in the sort of repertoire of images of Washington. This one, there are actually two versions of this now that I know of. One is at the Winterthur Museum in Wilmington, Delaware, in a private collection, and the other smaller one, actually quite small, I mean, we think of these as being large, like the Washington at Dorchester Heights, hangs at Mount Vernon. And this was one of the earlier battles. Washington is overlooking the Hudson here at Verplancks Point, just north of New York City in Manhattan. And this happened to be Martha Washington's own favorite of her husband's. And there's a great quote of Trumbull saying that he worked attentively on all of the specifics here of the uniform, and he calls it the horse furnishings. And you see all these dripping kinds of reins and He's got a rosette here and these breastplates. But note, it's interesting that Martha loved the one of her husband with the bulging, stomach there. And I think, again, we have to think back in sort of an 18th century mode here of whether he was considered to be, Washington, quite fit, quite the leader. He was over 6 feet tall. And yet, having a rounded stomach was considered in the Hogarthian, in the British context of sort of the sublime, to give you a great serpentine line that would have looked very appropriately nonchalant. And I think we're going to see that again when we look at the peel, but just bear that in mind because I think it's interesting. This was her personal favorite of her husband's. It's got certainly a casual feel to it, and Washington also did pose for Trumbull, so it is done from life, which is important to think about as we go forward. Here he is painting a different scene of Washington and Trenton. This is the same series of battles because he's going to cross the Delaware River and he's going to land in Trenton and have to march south for several miles before reaching Trenton. So it's a much more dynamic and dark scene. I think here what I wanted to bring forward is how much we're going to see in a moment the Apollo Belvedere plays in here, the ancient statuary. But look what he's holding. That spyglass. I think for those of you who know a little bit about Washington's own biography, he began his career as a surveyor, which is very important, and he never was without his spyglass. In fact, the spyglass, which would have been not just, of course, the tool of his early livelihood, but as a general would have been critical to his success in battle, in gauging terrain, distance to the enemy, amount of artillery or other forces, or disguise, and he actually entrusts this instrument to a man named William Lee, whom we're going to meet in just a moment. So, these two, important also to bear in mind, because of the one on the right, the Trumbull, was actually in Charleston. Now, I know many of you who are, I forgot to ask how many of you actually are gallery instructors or museum associates, but I know if you've been giving tours in the gallery and you are standing in front of Gilbert Stuart's Washington at Dorchester Heights, you are inevitably asked about the rear end and hindquarters of this horse. Am I right? I see a lot of nods out there. What I would suggest here, a couple things, and I do address that in the Spotlight publication. First off, that the power of a horse, for those of you who ride, and Washington was known to be a really superb equestrian as well as, and William Lee was as well. This is where the power of the horse derives. The rear quarters are where horses, whether they race or jump or whatever they do, and certainly whatever they're needed to do in battle, is from the hindquarters. But in this case, in Dorchester Heights, I think Stuart is playing off of the fact that the artillery that General Knox, whom again we're going to meet in a moment, dragged up from Fort Ticonderoga through western Massachusetts, where there were no roads, with oxen, to the promontory of Dorchester Heights, which physically has an overlook to Boston Harbor, scared the British to such a degree that they actually turned tail and withdrew from Boston Harbor. So this was an important early victory for the Continental Army, which had been commissioned here in Cambridge, very important for, I think, the Bostonians' connection to the cult of Washington, because he took on the commission as general of the Continental Army here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But this idea of turning tail, that sort of dynamism of, I think, even if, again, the tail sort of swatting away these British forces, and the fleet that then withdrew, just seeing these cannon overlooking the Boston Harbor. But there was another precedent around that certainly would have been known to these artists and to Sully as well, about the hindquarters. And this is sort of an interesting story in that John Trumbull also received a commission for a full-length Washington from the fathers of the city of Charleston. And he came up with an initial image, which was, I'm going to go back. I have to get it here. Sorry. Let's see. Sorry, I didn't have it in here. It's much more on this order. Actually, I'm sorry. It is this one of this style. Except it's not at Trenton, but it's of him standing with a horse like this. I should have brought it along. But the fathers in Charleston didn't care for that image. And Trumbull had already painted this full-scale scene of Washington for them. So he decided that he would place the rear end of the horse framing Charleston here in the distance. And again, for those of you who ride, you'll know if a horse has its tail up, you better watch out because something's about to drop on from below. So this was what the fathers of Charleston accepted, and that's what's hanging in the town hall in Charleston. So just if you're down there, you may want to take a look at it. I'm sorry, the picture's a little bit on an angle, but that's... So again, Sully would have known these kinds of inner jokes and plays going on with some of these artists in terms of their commission. But here we are back to the passage of the Delaware. And let's get back to how it is that we get to this place. So in thinking about all these images of Washington, again, the North Carolina legislators are going to put out the call for painters, for those that they're going to ask. It turns out that Charles Willson Peale was not available, so they went to his son, Rembrandt Peale in Philadelphia. They go to Sully. And Sully, knowing he's up against the son of one of the great patriot painters, who's well known for painting many images of Washington too, thought to himself, well, I'm going to really do one better than this commission to paint not only a copy of a Gilbert Stuart, but also to someone else was going to sculpt the bust. He just had to worry about the copy. So he says, well, I'll paint that copy for you. But I'll also do something else. I'm going to paint something for you that I'm going to call an historical portrait. And this was something nobody had ever really thought about, but an historical portrait. At the time, in the correspondence that we have, he does, and on your reading list, you'll see that Fail article, which will reproduce actually all of the archives. So if you want to take a look at that, that's where you should go. He, in talking about the historical portrait, he initially proposes the turning point of the evening of Christmas night, 1776, the battles of Trenton and Princeton, as one of the topics. But interestingly, he also underbids very actively what he thinks Rembrandt Peale's going to come in at, by like under half. And he not only, Rembrandt Peale's going to come in at like $3,500, unframed for the paintings, and Sully's going to come in with these two options for them to have really something spectacular because he wants to really make a name for himself. And he's coming in not only less than half, but he says to them, which I think sealed the deal, I will deliver these two pictures framed. And they are so excited in the North Carolina State House that they rapidly sign up this young artist because they don't want him to go back on his offer. So he gets to work, and he's going to get to work working on this picture in thinking about how he's going to portray this monumental event and deliver it to the North Carolina. This one was for the Senate chamber. There was the copy was for the chamber of the House. Now, I brought in, and I hope you'll take a look at this in our gallery, because this large scale, you may be saying, what does this have to do with Thomas Sully? Well, in thinking about models for what he could rely upon and what he could draw upon, the great American painter Benjamin West, also who, like Sully, had to really pull himself up by his bootstraps. He was born in Pennsylvania and sort of learned locally before heading to England to become the painter for George III, the King of England, the greatest position one could have. So he actually painted this scene in England for a very specific public gallery called the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery, which had a short life. It was a great sort of experiment in demonstrating, as West thought, to the international community that the British painters were worthy painters of history and literature. So history had been expanded at this point, not just to include the stories of ancient literature or the Bible, Old and New Testaments, but now could be taken from even the literature of Shakespeare, as in this case, King Lear. So he painted these very large canvases. This one is about 6 by 8.5 feet, let's say. You can go over and look at it in the gallery. But and I was trying to track down, for the book, whether Sully would have actually been able to see this very Lear in England, because that's where the gallery was, knowing that his parents were both actors, and the whole Shakespeare gallery was all scenes of Shakespearean plays. Not clear that he would have seen it there, but to sponsor these large-scale oil paintings, West had issued engravings that were sold by subscription as part of the way of supporting the gallery. So we do have here in our own collection, you'd be welcome to go visit that in the Moore study room if you make an appointment, but we do have engravings by a British engraver named Boydell after these very large canvases. We had some of them out in the gallery. But what I want you to note here, and you can do this for yourselves when you're standing in front of the Sully and you look to your left and look at the King Lear, is that this dynamic action that's unfolding as though on a stage, very intentional, something Sully would have, whether he saw this or not or saw it in prints, would have been quite familiar with. So you immediately get the sense of these great gestures that had to carry distances on the stage. So here we have King Lear, and you see everybody gesticulating and reacting to the scene. And that is important in terms of thinking about the shallowness also of this composition. So very much, I think, on Sully's mind in terms of his own theatricality. And Benjamin West had been himself an innovator in thinking about contemporary history in this work. It's really considered one of the watersheds that we point to, although, of course, in the history of art, there are always transitions that occur over time. So again, this one gets much of the credit. But the death of General Wolfe in the Battle of Quebec, taken from really religious imagery of the descent from the cross. So the flag here standing in, here's Wolfe expiring there. We know we're in the New World with this Native American contemplating the scene. And as you see clusters of officers surrounding the central figure, almost like those around the Lamentation of Christ or the descent from the cross, but very much a departure in terms of showing history happening and unfolding on the battlefield. And this one, again, widely reproduced in engravings. So while he might not have seen it, Sully, let's say, in the flesh, he did end up traveling prior to painting the Passage of the Delaware to England. He managed to cobble together a sponsorship to allow him to be in London for about 8 to 9 months. And that was important. He did have a letter of introduction to Benjamin West, who made available to him his entire collection and offered him the chance to study that. Also in England at this time would have been this huge painting, Copley's Death of Major Pearson. It's bigger than the Passage of the Delaware, which is 12 by 17 feet. This one's like 14 by 19 feet. So on the scale of these large panoramic paintings that were often shown as really in some ways the precursor to modern day film. So you would have, if you know our cyclorama here in Boston, would have had scenes of the Civil War that would have moved in front of your, as you sat there. These large scale battle scenes are really attempting to put you in surround sound, to use this sort of film thinking of these, and to place you right in the thick of battle. And in this case, I think, again, you get that feel for how Copley is hemming in the scene and creating this shallow composition towards the front of what we call the picture plane. It's pushing it towards, if you think of it in terms of a stage, toward the proscenium edge. And you could think of the action here really unfolding. We tend to be Western readers, so we're thinking sort of left to right as Western readers. So this man gesticulating from his injury where he's been part of the Fife and Drum Corps. Here's Major Pearson dramatically being carried out of the battle, having taken a wound to the chest. And then you see the scene sort of progressing here to the right as these women and children reacting to it or rushing off stage left. So again, very much feels like that theatricality happening in the work of Copley. And again, Sully would have been able to see these kinds of works and certainly would have been able to meet Copley when he was in England. But in thinking about the kind of theatricality. This had been ongoing for a long time in the realm of revolutionary sort of dramatic events. And I brought this one along, the great neoclassical painter of France, Jacques-Louis David, right before as the French Revolution was unfolding here, because the ancient scene of the oath of the Horatii swearing their oath as the women in the family are sort of expiring, knowing they're going to be going out to their deaths on the battlefield. These kinds of paintings, and they were also reproduced widely in popular engravings, were actually staged in festivals that were in support of the revolution. So again, it makes this connection between painting, the reproductive mode of engraving, let's say, of popular prints, and then transmitting into the populace through in real time as performance. So they are all reinforcing these kinds of very, very dramatic images and intentionally theatrical, where you do feel again like you have a sort of stage drop behind these brilliantly lit figures in the foreground. Now, interestingly, I think here we're looking at some more of the French types of battle scenes that might have inspired Thomas Sully. He never actually was able to travel to France. He didn't have enough money, and West kind of urged him to stay in London and work hard, and he said, I'll make everything available to you in my collection, but don't bother with France. He was sort of a little bit anti-French. But the French had initiated in the middle of the 19th century, later on, a sort of whole hall of battles that would commemorate many of these large-scale scenes. These would have already been available if Sully had gotten to the Louvre, but again, were widely disseminated in prints and books here in the United States and certainly in England. And this is the student of Jacques-Louis David painting in 1808, and I brought this one along because I think it's important to actually give Sully a fair amount of credit as someone working in the United States with fairly limited resources, even though he gets abroad, because here we have Napoleon at Eylau. It was a winter battlefield. You see him here on his white horse, although in this picture looks a little bit more golden. This was considered at the time to be very, very gruesome for its reality of all of these frozen corpses that are pictured right there in the foreground for you. And I just want to call attention to how he's clustered the officers and the generals shown by their hats and plumes here around Washington, and yet how this grouping of these soldiers kind of paying homage, as you see the one man almost, kissing his foot there, like the sort of Christ figure almost, that, he's gesticulating to the crowd here, the victor in this really gory battle, but how the winter landscape, the foreground and the background in this case, don't really cohere, don't really come together. So unlike the stage sets we've been seeing, let's say with West or with Copley, or as we just saw with his teacher, Jacques-Louis David, now we have a bit of a confusing kind of scene in terms of how you make sense of all of these different actions happening that are quite interesting, and you can imagine yourself standing in front of this. Would have been as bigger than our screen here that we're showing this on. So you can imagine yourself standing in front of it and sort of looking at it and engrossing in the battle, but yet as a composition, I don't think it's particularly successful. But I did want to bring it along because it gives you a feel for how Sully is working through the complexity of what he's trying to represent. And I didn't want you to forget that, of course, John Trumbull had set himself to painting many of the scenes of the Revolution. We have one here in the gallery that you can certainly take a look at, that's in the collection, another on loan to us, actually, that you can take a look at as well. This one, as you see, General Warren expiring in the Battle of Bunker Hill, a bit of a take on the death of General Wolfe in a slightly different direction. Of course, here you see the main action happening here at the left as this figure is gesticulating. We have one of the, I think it's important to note, as it was noted in the key to this work, in an engraving that went along with it, that the African Americans fought alongside the Americans, and that Washington actually led the first integrated army with the Continental Army. So that's something to bear in mind that Trumbull has alluded to, although it's very hard for us to actually tell who this particular soldier might be. He wasn't identified in the key, as I suppose in at that time might have occurred. So back to the two great Stuarts. Sully, as I mentioned, had studied with Stuart, so he's going to be thinking about these full lengths that would have been something he would have known well, as he had studied in Stuart's studio. Here is the ancient statuary of the Apollo Belvedere, widely reproduced in all sorts of engravings. It was already available to someone like John Singleton Copley here in the United States, and you can see how they've just altered the pose here, but are very much thinking of Washington in this mode of harking back to the great monuments of ancient Rome. I don't think as an equestrian portrait you can not introduce this work, because I think for every painter of equestrian portraits it would have been on, probably on Sully's mind. It was also widely reproduced. This is Napoleon, again on his white horse. This is also shown in an alternative version on a bay horse, but here on his white horse, the Roman consuls often rode the white horse to distinguish them from the rest of the flanks of the armies. In the case of the David, you've got Bonaparte, and he's paired here with Hannibal, well known for crossing the Alps with elephants. And there was a little, you see in some of the later takes on this where some of the other artists are looking to take David and Napoleon down a notch. He's actually crossing the Alps on a donkey. So if you see a Delaware French painter, you'll see it's not sort of all things forward with the cape flying perfectly and the perfect equipoise, which would be, imagine, hard to hold on a steep, snowy cliff like that. But, there he is, sort of poised for all time. So I think Sully, in sort of seeking models, is looking at many of the royal collections, including this one in England. This is actually a sketch for the Whitehall ceiling, the banqueting house in Whitehall, England. And here you see the Duke of Buckingham in a very loose sketch by Peter Paul Rubens, this one at the Kimball. But again, something he would have been able to look at actually in person before it suffered from fire. And again, interestingly, in England was this work by Anthony Van Dyck of Charles I, and guess who's walking beside him there? That is the man who was in charge of equitation in England, and it was a gift to the king. So again, I think it would have been of interest for Sully to see this, here's a royal figure with someone nearby, you can see holding on to his helmet there, sort of attending to him, but yet not mounted. And how do you integrate these two in a successful portrait? And I brought along Van Dyck's teacher, Peter Paul Rubens, just to show you that, of course, Van Dyck is thinking about the great equestrian portraits that Rubens himself had painted in the early 17th century, this one of the Duke of Lerma. And they're each carrying that baton, which is a symbol of power. So that's like their symbolic mace that they would have had there by virtue of their role as Duke or King. So here he is, thinking about how to integrate this scene of what's going on. So what is going on? Well, at this point, we are met with a bitterly cold night, December 25th, 1776. Washington had, with the Continental Army, that early success you heard about at Dorchester Heights in Boston, but it's really been a tough slog. He's lost heavily at the Battle of New York, which was personally a huge defeat for him that he had hoped to be more successful with. He's now about with these in the Continental Army. Of course, it's not really the way we think of an army today. These are regiments from different parts of the country fighting with Washington for the sake of the Patriot cause. So they are units from Connecticut, from New Jersey, from Delaware, from Pennsylvania, from all over, and from Massachusetts. And they also have particular strengths depending on what part of the country they are from. So Washington realizes at this point, and the reason it's such a turning point in the historical story, and there I really commend to you David Hackett Fisher's book, Washington's Crossing. It's on your handout. He's a professor at Brandeis. I believe he's a university professor, and he can teach anything at this point, but he's a superb historian. He dedicated 900 pages or more to the crossing in every aspect. So again, I listed him here he was my number one person because he provided us with so much great detail that I think you'll enjoy reading about. So Washington realizes this is the moment of last resort. If he's going to demonstrate to the Congress that this army is worthy of support to go up against the greatest military power in the world, the British Empire, he needs to win this battle. And to do so, he is going to basically risk everything he has. Every man, actually there were women traveling with the army too. They're not pictured here, but they were. He's going to bring all of his heavy artillery. He's going to bring his best generals to this task. He's going to talk about it, and then they're going to create a plan of attack. So what they did was they divided into 3 different units. They were all going to plan to cross the Delaware at night. This was important to the surprise that they were hoping to attack the British, and who were fighting with the help of the Hessian mercenaries at Trenton early in the morning after Christmas. And there is a lot of lore about their thinking that they would have been had a lot of drinks the night before on Christmas celebration. Again, I think Fisher debunks that a bit but nonetheless, it was definitely intended as a surprise attack. So a couple of important things I think to bear in mind. The weather was really, really challenging. At the time they are about to embark on this at night, suddenly they're facing a northeaster with heavy winds, snow, sleet, and ice. And while it was a full moon, they couldn't see anything because the moon was completely obscured. Washington ahead of time had really roused the troops by giving them the password for these 3 different units. Remember, they're all traveling at different locations on the Delaware River. They're all going to attempt to cross it at night and then gather in converge on Trenton from 3 different directions to really surround the British and the Hessians. So he says to them, your password is victory or death. I think that gives you a sense of what they were up against. And another interesting fact, and this is from, again, David Hackett Fisher's great research, that because it was so difficult to see that night, he instructed all of the men, and they didn't all have uniforms, as we're going to see in a moment here as well, to place white sheets of paper in the backs of their hat. The reason for that was that their officers would be leading from the front, and that they would be out in the charge ahead of those from behind. So this white piece of paper would give the soldier behind a chance to have a visible mark to follow, almost like a painted road, marking on the roads. But this was carried through the military all the way up to those that landed on the Normandy beaches, who had painted small stripes on the backs of their helmets so that they could follow each other into battle. But this was something initiated back with the Continental Army. So he's got to figure out how to present this dramatic moment. They're poised on the banks of the Delaware. Washington is surrounded, and we're going to look at all of these people. This is the group of his inner coterie. You see him on this very frozen bank, the Delaware River behind, and then dawn is breaking there out in the distance. And again, we're going to unpack each part of this story here, but just become familiar with sort of all the discrete elements. And how is he going to make this very, very dramatic? Of course, Washington doesn't know at this point that the other 2 units are not going to be able to cross the river, that his is going to be the only unit able to cross. And you can also go visit the crossing site, as I did in Pennsylvania, and go take a look at that. It's quite interesting and see what's going on. But just for those of you who are very knowledgeable about this part of the world, you'll know that they actually don't cross from sort of the eastern side. If we think of a map being east, west, north, south, they actually crossed from the western side into New Jersey to the east. So he's conflating already for us if we think of a map as it's often presented, east, west, north, south. So he's showing them here clustered at the side, but he's also featuring Washington in the center. So thinking about how to portray the general in terms of his equestrian portrait. You met these 2 earlier, both by Trumbull at Verplank's Point, and his version of the Battle of Trenton with the horse rearing in the background, with sort of a lot of confusion, a soldier sort of really trying to control the horse and sort of activity with the American flag, but a little bit hard to tell what's going on in this version by Trumbull. He probably was thinking about equestrian statuary like this one in Venice. It might have been available to him in prints, but certainly was widely known in one of the great Venetian squares by Verrocchio. But he also is thinking about how to portray Washington's age. He would have been in his mid-40s at this point when he was leading the Continental Army, and yet so many of the images of Washington we think about are of him as a much older man. And interestingly, by terms of the commission, because he's going to have to do this from, posthumously after Washington has already died, he specifically asks the legislators of North Carolina whether he may portray Washington as he would have been at the younger age. And he mentions these two busts specifically in the letters about the commission because he says, I want to be able to try to invest some life into this scene by basing it on those that I know. And I mentioned this, the Udon earlier, but we checked this out we have lots of, writing about Washington I found in the process was a bit like writing about Jesus Christ. There's so many people who are very interested in his life and every aspect of him, and I don't profess to be a pure Washington expert. So I checked a lot of these things out with my colleagues in Mount Vernon. One of them is they have the Udon bust as well there, and one of the labels on their bust had talked about Udon traveling around Mount Vernon with Washington after the Revolution, of course, as he's retired there, like the great General Cincinnatus, and he's back on his farm. And apparently the gaze that Udon found most arresting for this bust occurred when he witnessed Washington negotiating to purchase some horses, and the figure that he was quoted was way above what Washington thought it was going to be, and he was quite indignant and taken back by the price. So supposedly that's the lore. Apparently, again, with a lot of the myth of Washington, it gets copied and copied and copied, but that is what Mount Vernon had. So again, to get this sense of his sort of lifelikeness. But we also had here and I wanted to show this, and I reproduced it in the book because I'm hopeful that maybe some Washington experts are going to give us a little more information on this. This is actually one of our earliest Washington objects to come into the collection in Boston in the late 19th century, and it is a life mask by Udon. Not clear whether it was done after the fact or at the time of. We just don't know, and we've looked at it with our colleagues in the Art of Europe and sort of our sculpture experts and Udon experts, but it's been here a very long time. I think I mentioned earlier the connection of Boston to George Washington, not just because of his commission in the Continental Army, but also because of his they ended up acquiring so many of his books. Right here at the Boston Athenaeum, we have more books than he has, than are actually available at his home at Mount Vernon. So back to our painting and what's going on the right side of this composition. Let's walk you through who these people are. Well, first of all, we know who this man is. He's mounted, he's gesticulating with a sword. It's General Knox. Now, why do we know that? This is our portrait of General Knox in the gallery, painted by Gilbert Stuart as an older man, shown here with a cannon. Knox was born here in Boston. He had witnessed the Boston Massacre. He was a bookseller, but he was just fascinated by artillery from a very young age, and an expert at knowledge, and particularly, I think, a man of just sheer drive and will, who not only dragged those cannons up from Fort Ticonderoga to the Battle of Dorchester Heights, as he's shown here posing, but he helped Washington again in the Battle of New York, and he helped him here this night. He was in charge of artillery there, and that's what's going on. It turns out in the course of his life, Knox had lost part of his his left thumb, and if you notice here, that's being deftly put aside by Sully. He's not going to show that hand. What I love about the details here, and you can see it a little bit, but more in the painting itself, is how he's managed to capture that cold, bitterly cold air, the fact that the horse is actually breathing out. His breath is becoming sort of frozen the minute he's breathing there. We also know who this man is. He was in Washington's entourage. This man who's mounted here is William Lee. We know that because he was by Washington's side. He was a slave in Washington's household. Washington had actually purchased both William Lee and his brother, and it's listed there. You can read the documents in the Spotlight book. Interestingly, the woman who sold these two men to Washington was the widow of a man named Henry Lee. And so in tracking this down for the Spotlight book, it turns out that these two men in Washington's household, enslaved men, were actually, it was the great nephew of Mary Lee, who is credited with the great eulogy of Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen at the time of his death. So quite interesting. But he was described as a mulatto man in the terms of Washington's will. And the whole discussion of Washington and slavery is a very complex one. And again, I don't profess to be a scholar of American slavery, but I did get into this with my colleagues at Mount Vernon, and of course there have been many books dedicated and articles to this subject. So there are a couple in the Spotlight book I really commend to you. But I'll just give you the brief version that's relevant to our story here, which is that Washington struggled with slavery. He knew it was wrong. He, as a young boy, had inherited slaves. He also, when he married Martha Washington, inherited what were called dower slaves. Women couldn't own property, so therefore he owned these slaves. He knew that the slavery issue was such a divisive one of North and South, and they had fought so hard for revolution to create a union that he was conflicted about it. But over time, he realized he knew he had to get out of the issue of slavery. So at the end of his life, he drew up two different documents for his last will and testament. And as he knew, when he knew he was dying, he asked Martha to destroy one and to retain one, which effectively freed all of his slaves. He specifically mentioned William Lee, who was not only in his lifetime known for his great ability as an equestrian, but was known as, Washington said to him, he has his freedom. He may either by his choice remain at Mount Vernon with a pension for his entire life, or he may leave Mount Vernon if that is his choice. He actually chose to stay at Mount Vernon. But he was specifically honored by Washington for his great services to this country during the Revolution. I think it's amazing to think that these two men only returned to Mount Vernon twice during the entire time they were fighting the American Revolution. But ironically, we're not able to know where William Lee is actually buried. We think he's buried in the African-American graveyard at Mount Vernon. But despite that long history and importance, again, his actual gravestone is not well known, although it was said to have been seen at one point during the later 19th century, but again, more work to be done there. I'm showing you here the Metz painting, which is called John Trumbull, George Washington. No mention of William Lee, although he's the man there in the background with Washington's horse, wearing a sort of colorful livery and wearing what is probably a confection of a hat, looking a bit Caribbean or sort of made up to look like a kerchief that might have been worn by African Americans from Caribbean origins, which they were wearing them here in the United States, but again, probably not in battle, so it's a bit of a confection, but of course he's not even mentioned. But in Sully's painting, not only is he mounted, rather, but he's shown with a very particular hat. It's a fur-lined hat with a cap, not something, again, known to me, but fortunately a number of military experts on military costume identified this as a particular type of hat worn by the American regulars when they were fighting in cold weather, particularly up in places like Canada and other places. So that's what William Lee is wearing. And interestingly, while he is not wearing the blue and the buff uniforms as Washington had designed for the officers, he is wearing some equipment, this metal strap with this leather strap with this metal plate, which which we know actually was for, we don't know that the equipment was for the spyglass, but we do know William Lee was entrusted during battle, during the Revolution, with Washington's most important objects, of which one of them was the spyglass. So again, shown here, not only mounted with the officers, but likely conferring with them. Not quite clear, but certainly looking at the face of this officer to the right. Not clear who this officer is, and again, I put him in the book with speculation. It's so clearly a portrait, and Sully was clearly a portraitist. He has a very distinctive profile with this very prominent Roman nose and bushy eyebrow, the type of hat with the feather, very dramatic, but not clear who he is. Could be Joseph Reed, one of the generals that Washington particularly favored. But I tended in the book, I believe it's closer to Nathaniel Greene, another general. And the reason I think that, and I'd love to be hearing more from all of you if you have others who are experts in this, is that Nathaniel Greene was really very loyal to Washington throughout the Revolution and actually took on the command of the Southern armies in the South after, of course, this battle, but he took that on nearby Raleigh, North Carolina. So again, thinking about where this picture would have been seen in North Carolina, they would have known Nathaniel Greene as the general of the Southern Command of the Continental Army. And nearby, if you get down to the Yale University Art Gallery, you'll see a whole series of these patriots painted by Trumbull. They're quite small. They're sort of miniatures framed into single frames, and this is shown much larger than it is. It's about this big. But here's Nathaniel Greene, and why it's so difficult to tell. The noses are a little different, the ages are a little different, and we almost never see them exactly as we would have wanted to in the exact pose that Sully is choosing. Now, this man became a bit of an enigma to me because, of course, so little of his face is showing. He's got his collar tipped up. He's looking out from under a hat. Here are some candidates. This man is a man named Samuel Blatchley Webb, who was one of the aides-de-camps working for Washington that night. And the other candidate is John Trumbull, and we happen to have, it's not on view now, but this early self-portrait by Trumbull soon after he left the Army. Now, what's tricky about Trumbull is he was actually thought to be a spy during the Revolution. It's not quite clear where his whereabouts were on the night of December 25th, 1776. He was certainly in the vicinity, but he wasn't actually at Washington's side. But if you're Thomas Sully and you're thinking about how to present something and sort of leave behind a trail, I think you might think about John Trumbull. So I actually propose in the book that it may even be an amalgam of these two men. Samuel Blatchley Webb happened to be one of the great historians of the Revolution. Although his father had died and his stepfather spent all of his money, he had an education. And he had a terrific hand of calligraphy. All of his papers are at the Sterling Library at Yale, and I actually looked at them, and they're just written beautifully. So Washington loved using these young men to write all of his dispatches from the field. So he would have been someone whose archives would have been available for Sully to consult. But as you can see, they're both actually we're both from the same area of Connecticut, of the Connecticut River Valley. They kind of almost look alike. Trumbull originally from Connecticut as well, so unclear, but Trumbull would have been the great painter of the Revolution. So if he combined these two, he may have, but I think if I had to argue for one, I'm going to go with Trumbull. So back to our image, I promised that I would show you Washington's hat. And it's very important that this ribbon, it's hard to see from the floor, and it's virtually impossible to see in this image here, but I can promise you that our conservators in infrared have found that Sully actually signed Washington's hat. But because it's so high above the floor, and when he later had to show this picture around the country, he also signed the bottom of the blanket, and that's a little bit easier to see. It's right here, and you can almost see that from the floor of the gallery, so take a look for that. I wanted to tell you what's going on in the middle ground. That is what was really one of the urgencies of the evening, to get across that ice-clogged river. And they did this with the help of John Glover, General John Glover from Marblehead, Mass., with his regiment, who was really well known for they were not deterred by snow and ice being from Marblehead. They were used to frozen harbors, and he had already helped Washington get across and retreat from New York. So he was used to these evening maneuvers. And in the 18th century, none of these soldiers really could. I would be surprised if any of them had learned to swim, but he was able to transport every single man, horse, and cannon across that river that night without losing a single one to the river. So good for General Glover. This is his statue here on Commonwealth Avenue, on the Commonwealth Mall. This photograph is what the ice would have actually looked like. I hope you can appreciate this because Kim McCarty from the crossing site took this in the winter of 15, our epic winter here in Boston. This was what they were facing on the Delaware, so very much the kind of ice that probably Washington faced, but they are literally huge shards of ice that form on this rapidly flowing river. And there you see how he's linked the foreground and the background so beautifully, I think, here with the rooted landscape of the winter landscape with this tree branch, the tail of his white horse here named Blueskin, looking out over the horizon towards dawn, which that was an artistic license. They were able to finally get across the river at about 3 a.m. They had aimed for about midnight, and they had another about 7 miles to march on the opposite side. So he's framing that dawn on the horizon for you in the tree branch, sort of the V shape of this tree branch, so that you focus on sort of the dawning of the new American Republic there that this battle is going to lead towards. Now, there's something very specific about the artillery, which is going on here, and I haven't addressed that, but we have a few more minutes, and I just want to show you what transpired in the many conversations with various experts. One is that this particular cannon, and I urge you to go look at it. I don't have the up-close detail, but you'll see it has a curved handle on it. It's a type of dolphin handle that was actually produced quite regularly in France by the French arsenal. And it turned out that secretly, although not in 1776, but during the American Revolution, the French sold every piece of artillery to the American patriots to help them fight the British. And interestingly, this was done through a man named Silas Deane, who happened to be the stepfather of one of those aides-de-camps that I showed a moment ago, Samuel Blatchley Webb. So here's an image of the cannon. Military historian and art historian Christopher Bryant has in his personal collection. These were in the Caribbean, in Haiti, and came up the same group that were sold. They didn't actually show up in the United States, in the American colonies until the following May of 1777. But they were extremely important to the success of the entire revolution, which is probably why, again, anachronistically, Peale is including them. And, I'm sorry, Sully's including them, and also Peale included them as well. And if you look closely at Peale's painting, you'll see that he has often included the handles of the dolphin handles. Now, since the Spotlight book came out, I received a letter from one historian who thought that perhaps the man struggling with the cannon was none other than Alexander Hamilton, and I know he's enjoying a great deal of hip-hop fame these days, and we'll have a great program at the end of this week here at the MFA around him. But I wanted to remind you about our own two images of Hamilton and just show you that it could be him possibly, although I think it's more a symbol of sort of every man struggling with the, from the rank and file, trying to get these very heavy cannon down this snowy bank and onto those scows, these sort of large flatboats that were transporting, that did transport goods across the Delaware in regular times, and in wartime, of course, men and women as well as cannon and horses. I showed you this branch of the dawn of the new American Revolution, but I wanted to focus on another aspect of the uniform here. I mentioned the blue and the buff. That was to Washington's specification. It was based on his own designs for his earlier regiment that he fought with in Virginia before he became the leader of the Continental Army. The blue for him would have symbolized the cause of the Tories in England, the bright blue, and the buff was the facing he felt went the best with it. He was very practical as a rider. He thought you should have comfortable breeches, but he also specified these buttons that were quite large and were also flat with nothing on them, meaning no crests, no detail of any sort. So at one point in my office, this is my old, this is my office, but I had this hanging up as I was working on the Spotlight book. This was one of the flags from when we opened up the Art of the Americas wing that hung along the streets. And I often have, this was like our Jamie Wyeth board, I often have the images near me, so while I'm on the phone or I'm thinking about something, I can have it. Well, I was staring at this flag and suddenly noticed, oh my gosh, look at that. What's painted on this button? But none other than a large trapezoid with a small figure and a maul stick leaning over it, right there. Now, of course, how is that going to be reflected in this particular image on the shores of the Delaware at Christmas night? It's not. This is Sully leaving his little mark behind of him actually painting the canvas. So as I started looking at that, I said, oh my goodness, what else is on these buttons? Well, here you see this little shape here is actually his white horse named Blueskin, his ear. And let's go down. Oh, sorry, I'll go back one. You have to go in, and right here, you can see, if you look carefully, it's actually the horse's head is reflected in the buttons. So he's using the fact that these buttons are quite flat to say, I was there, I was part of this, and I'm going to leave my signature. It's a little thing that artists do, and if you don't think that it's the case, you'll know that Jan van Eyck did it in the marriage portrait of the Arnolfinis at the National Gallery of London, and even our friend Jamie Wyeth did it twice in the on the sunglasses. He's standing up painting his friend here, and he actually did it in the rivet as well. So artists love to leave behind these little signatures, and for a man who's already signed the painting twice, I think it's interesting that he left his signature and Washington's horse on the buttons. Oh, sorry, here's the detail. So here's a bit more of the horse's head. You can see the bridle there, and here is the ear. So keep looking. I've been looking at all these revolutionary buttons ever since, and the original uniform, if you're interested, the only uniform that survives, which is after this period, Washington wore even up until his death, and it's at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. So let's quickly just go through a bit about the history of this painting. Sully gets so excited about painting this commission that he ends up painting a painting 12 by 17 feet for a space that's 9 by 13 feet. So he has to part ways with the commissioners in an amicable way because, of course, he wants to make his reputation. And he decides that immediately they will exhibit this painting around the country. Fortunately for us, it was rolled early on, and it traveled around the country, beginning in Norfolk, Virginia, and moving up the coastline. Here you see it as it's available. You see one of the ads for it. He showed it to the public, and it eventually made its way here to Boston, where it was bought by John Doggett for $500. John Doggett was a frame maker. He made the original frame. These are later versions of John Doggett's museum, which was over on Tremont Street. He sold it to another museum owner, and so it sat in what was called the Boston Museum, not a relation to our museum, in the 19th century in this compendium with, you know, the dying Gaul and taxidermy. Even a mermaid was supposedly in this mix, but lots of portraits. It was very much on the order of Peale's Museum in Philadelphia, and you see it there, later made its way to this grand staircase. That's where it was in 1903 when this photograph was taken of it, before the last group of trustees that were part of the Boston Museum decided to give it to our museum, the MFA Boston, founded in 1870, so that it could be better seen and appreciated by the public. Well, that was probably the last time it was ever together in its frame, and it inspired many different kinds of images. This one by Edward Hicks that was owned by, for many years, the Crossing site, although in many other versions as well. And I think you know the great one we started with at the Met of the 1850s. Here it is at the Boston Museum, 1903, the picture. And I'm just going to let you take a look as you see the passage of the Delaware working with our conservators, led by Rona Macbeth, and actually every conservator worked on it, particularly Charlotte Ameringer, and our facilities crew. This work took 11 days to install in the wing, and you can take a look at this on YouTube if you want to see it there as well. It had been, as I said, rolled during its lifetime, which was good for us, and paintings are always rolled with the paint on the outside. It was rolled again after it was conserved. It took 4,000 hours to conserve the painting and the frame to have it be ready for the Art of the Americas wing in 2010. And I'm sure it's been seen. We know the first year about 1.7 million people actually were able to see it. So here is Charlotte and everyone tacking it. Here they are working with the frame, which was the original frame that John Doggett had made. And you see everybody in unison really lifting it up for the first time in the empty gallery, of course, because it was the first painting to go in. The first object had been the Manning House beam. So it's, there it is, getting into the frame. And now you see the frame turning around. And we had to do this. The man who's photographing there was actually from the Boston Globe. As we were doing this, the frame actually started to make a loud sort of cracking sound, which, again, we're not allowed to react if the Globe is watching us, but here it is, as you see it, fully installed in the Art of the Americas wing for your great enjoyment. And with that, I'm going to stop there. I open it up for some questions, and thank you so much for your great attention to Sully's painting. We've got some microphones here. Let's see, anybody have any questions out there? Yes, there's one. Here, they'll pass you a mic if you want, or I can repeat it for you. There you go. Thanks, Lauren.
Yes. Well, in the painting, at the back, what is it in the back of the horse? It looks like it's a piece of fabric or something. I'm not quite.
Oh,
what is it?
The winter blanket.
Oh, is that what it is?
This over the saddle. It was really, really cold that night, and he's actually riding with a sort of probably piece of skin fur over the saddle to stay warm. I should have pointed out also the two horses were based on Washington's own horses that he rode into battle, and I did discuss these in the book a bit. Blueskin he didn't actually own at that time, but was later at Mount Vernon for the public's enjoyment, and was his white horse that he frequently rode into public processions. The horse he preferred for battle is this horse, Nelson, although Nelson, again, he didn't quite own at that time, but it was named for a fellow Virginian who gave Nelson to him. Nelson was never disturbed by cannon fire or artillery, so that's why Washington preferred him. But if you see the way that Sully has juxtaposed these two, he's really had one is really standing with sort of a balletic, very poised kind of stance, sort of really on that moment of sort of before you cross the Rubicon of Washington, as everyone said, was incredibly calm in the face of battle. And here you see Nelson, at least here, being restrained by this aide-de-camp, and he's wearing this blanket coat, which was, again, something the soldiers wore against the bitter cold. It was worn as sort of an overcoat over the uniform. And we know that because of the black, the furriness of it, but also the black trim on the collar. It would have been like a Pendleton blanket stripe there that's being shown. Any other? Yes, back there.
So keep going and tell us a little bit about Sully after this painting.
Oh, okay. So I'll tell you a little bit more. I had a little bit more, but I wanted to open it up for questions. He continued, it wasn't the great success he thought it was going to be. Here he is in his studio in 1871, later on with one of the great Washingtons. However, immediately thereafter, he did get a number of commissions, such as this one by Thomas Jefferson. And here you see him painting at the time when Lafayette made his triumphal tour back in the United States in 1825. And I love the fact that he almost included his own little trope of his painting of the passage of the Delaware with the two horses in the background. In the detail there, you see here's the painting and the sort of bay and the white horse there in the background. So this one, and his probably most famous one was the portrait of Queen Victoria, this one at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So that, a very important commission for him. And interestingly, to go back to tie together the story of William Lee, Sully painted the passage of the Delaware in the city of Philadelphia. He had to rent rooms to do so because it was such a huge painting. He couldn't accommodate it in his studio. But of course, Philadelphia had already at this time passed laws that the children of blacks would be free during the Revolution. They already had determined that. And Sully himself participated not only in the abolition, but was very active in the establishment of Liberia. And he painted for the group of this man, Edward James Royce, and other African Americans who were involved in forming the state of Liberia. So like William Matthew Pryor, who painted a number of the African Americans here in Boston, Sully was doing the same in Philadelphia. So again, I think it introduces his portrayal of William Lee in a very different way, given the fact that many of the Quakers in Philadelphia were staunch abolitionists. Any other? Yes, Amy. Oh, yes, you mentioned, I should have noted how long, it was, the question was, it was painted quickly, and it was. He got the commission, it was approved in September, and he claims to have finished the painting in about mid-December now. I think he's giving himself a little bit of a chance to be in line with the Patriots of finishing around December, but certainly that's a very rapid amount of time to be painting such a large canvas. And he did not use assistants, unlike Rubens or others. We don't know of any assistants, whether he, I mean, I can't imagine who that would have been, but as a young artist, he unlikely could have afforded, and with the cost of not just the canvas, but the stretchers and the frame, this painting actually cost him money to produce. So he, later on in his biography, and they're listed there on your handout, William Dunlop says he wished the painting had been burnt. That's the quote. Not clear why he said that, but probably had something to do. He very carefully in his account books listed the cost of what it actually cost him to produce a painting in terms of the cost of linen canvas, wooden stretchers, and the materials, the oils, and the other materials, the frames. Well, I hope you enjoy the painting. Thank you so much for coming to the Revolution course. It's great to have you.